Hello everybody, it's time for our last video of this whole introductory sequence of plants. We've gone through bryophytes, we've gone through pteridophytes and gymnosperms, we've talked through some of the more basal angiosperms, and now we're finally on the final two major groups of plants, which are the most major, the eudicots and the monocots. Are you sad? I'm feeling pretty sad. If you're sad, you can hit like and subscribe down below. If you're happy, you can also hit like and subscribe down below. If you're not feeling happy or sad, you can also hit like and subscribe down below. But anyways, I was kind of thinking for quite a while on how to do this because, like I mentioned a lot of times, angiosperms are very diverse. And there's a lot of them, and the taxonomy and phylogeny is very, very complicated. So what I thought I would do is kind of a tour through the eudicots and monocots, just pointing out some of the many plants that I find very cool. And specifically, all of these plants have some sort of takeaway that I kind of want to point out that relates to the greater subject of botany, biology, or even just like the world in general. Just things to think about, I guess, because plants are very relevant. I was also thinking of making like maybe short form content similar to this video where I just talk about some cool plants. If you'd be interested in that, definitely let me know. But let's start with the legumes in family Fabaceae. So before I talk about what's interesting physiologically about them, let's talk a little bit about taxonomy, because they're a good example of the concept of types. So in like taxonomy and phylogeny, types come up a lot. Types are basically like a anchor point for an entire like group of organism, a taxon, basically. And legumes are a great example of type because the root faba is borrowed from the family to the order to a very big clade, the Fabids, which I pointed out in the last video. And basically, this is used not only to kind of name and define a group of plants, but also just to like provide a point of reference so that you kind of know all of these plants are related to this one group, in this case, the legumes. And another example of how types is used, there are type specimens for whole species. So say I have a species of animal, the type specimen is the very specific organism, usually preserved in like a museum or like preserved somewhere, I guess, that all of the other organisms of the species are compared to. And that is basically like this specific specimen that has been preserved is the representative of this species. And that is the type specimen. So there's also type species, which are representative of a genus, type genuses, which are representative of a family, and type family, and so that is kind of a concept that comes up pretty frequently in a plant taxonomy, at least. A lot of these other big clades borrow their roots from specific type families and genuses. But anyways, legumes. Not only are they pretty yummy and very nutritious, high in proteins and all that, but they are well known for having the ability to host nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their roots in places called nodules. So root nodules are where they host these bacteria. They are also called rhizobia. The bacteria, they're called rhizobia. And by associating with these rhizobia, they are able to restore soil nitrogen levels. So plants need nitrogen, and animals need nitrogen too. Life needs nitrogen, and the air has a lot of nitrogen, which is good. However, they cannot actually use that nitrogen. It needs to be made into a form that is able to be taken up by the plant's roots specifically. So they've evolved this kind of relationship with these bacteria that perform a chemical process called nitrogen fixation that takes the nitrogen in the atmosphere and converts it into usually like ammonia which then can be converted into all sorts of nitrogen compounds that can be taken up by plants. And this is very useful, especially in agriculture. So this has been used for thousands of years. Legumes have been planted in crop rotations with other agriculturally relevant plants. They're part of like the Three Sisters in like Native American agriculture, where basically their presence not only provides great food to eat, but also restores the nitrogen in the soil, like a fertilizer, multi-purpose fertilizer, basically. Two birds with one stone. So it's really great. And the main takeaway of this is just how much importance these plants have within their ecosystem and how they influence their environment and how that has also been used by humans. The next plants are orchids. Orchids are monocots, and they are probably the family with the most species, either that or Asteraceae. And the thing about orchids is that they have some pretty insane flowers. So we talked about how diverse angiosperm, like fruits and seed dispersal, are, and their angiosperm flowers are also incredibly diverse. And no other group of plants helps to kind of exemplify this than the orchids. So not only do orchids have some pretty weird modified like petals and sepals, for example, they usually have this kind of bilateral or zygomorphic structure where one of these petals is actually modified into a landing platform that insects can land onto. And then the noteworthy thing about orchids is that the other structures surrounding the pollen, which are packed into pollinia, I'll talk about that in a second, these other structures have co-evolved with their specific insect pollinators, usually insect pollinators, right? And this kind of phenomenon of coevolution is a very important takeaway, other than the incredible flower diversity, right? So coevolution is a phenomenon where two species become highly interdependent on one another, and when one evolves, the other kind of is selected for that. So it's a type of directional selection. The good example is orchids. So as I was saying, these structures surrounding the pollen sacs, they are evolved with their insect pollinators so that they like fit into each other like a hand and a glove, right? So these structures are perfectly structured to contact the like body structure of their specific pollinator perfectly. And this is further exemplified by this cool example of when Charles Darwin saw an orchid with a really, really long nectar spur. So the nectar is really far away from the main like pollen-bearing parts of the flower, I guess. And so he hypothesized that only a insect with a really long proboscis to reach the nectar, only the insect that could reach the nectar with this long proboscis would fit perfectly into the flower, like, a hand in a glove, like I was saying before. And this probably was brought along by coevolution, as explained in this diagram. If they have longer tongues, they'll live because they can eat the nectar. And then plants with longer spurs, I guess is what these are called, are also living more because then the insect contacts more of the pollen-bearing glands. And so the insect and the flower just co-evolve together until you get a flower with a very long spur and an insect with a very long proboscis. And Darwin actually predicted the existence of an insect a couple of years before the insect itself was actually discovered. And this was a moth, and it helps prove that evolution is real. Yes, I believe in evolution. Another cool adaptation of orchids is that they put their pollen in sacs. These are called pollinia. So instead of the pollen being just kind of like a powder that has to rub onto the insect's body and then hope it gets rubbed off, it is in these specialized sacs that greatly increase pollination efficiency. And another thing is that some of the orchid flowers are so highly adapted that they are great examples of mimicry in plants. So some of these flowers have become so specialized towards a specific pollinator that they start to look like other individuals of that pollinator species. And this is a phenomenon called Puyanian mimicry. Specifically, it has to deal with pseudocopulation. The flower kind of tricks its pollinator by pretending it is a member of its species, and the pollinator will try to mate with the flower, thinking that it is a member of their species. And this is called pseudocopulation. In the process of trying to mate with the flower, they pick up the pollen. So, yeah. Then there is Solanaceae, which exhibit a wide variety of a specific type of secondary metabolite called an alkaloid. Now, what does all of that mean? Solanaceae is a plant family commonly known as the nightshade family that includes some plants that you eat, like tomatoes, peppers, and potatoes. But they're united by the fact that a lot of them produce a lot of alkaloids. Alkaloids are a nitrogen containing compound that are a class of secondary metabolites. Secondary metabolites are compounds produced by plants that aren't like super necessary for vital functions. Primary metabolites like sugars and stuff are important just to basic survival. Secondary metabolites typically serve other purposes within the plant. In this case, most of these plants produce these compounds as a form of like immune defense to ward off pests and predators, and to kill like fungi, bacteria, viruses, anything that tries to eat them. However, the cool thing about Solanaceae is humans have discovered that some of their secondary metabolites produced have quite interesting effects on humans, and we've used them to the greatest effect. And so a lot of these plants have become very economically, culturally, and historically important. Good example are the peppers that produce capsaicin, spicy, right? And this is to ward off herbivores that try to eat them, but humans like pain, so we just breed them and make them as spicy as possible and then eat them for fun. There is the poppy, which has opium in some of its pods or capsules. And opium, if you know anything about history, it has quite a long role to play in there and has gotten a lot of humans addicted to it. Yeah. There's also nightshade, which produces a lot of tropane alkaloids. Nightshades have been used as effective ways to kill people, assassinate emperors and stuff. Very, very toxic substances. And we can't talk about toxic substances without talking about nicotine and its associated plant tobacco, which is probably the plant that has killed the most people in all of history. Nicotine is, of course, a very addictive chemical, but also just very culturally important, and tobacco has been grown for many, many years. So the thing to take away from Solanaceae is that a lot of just things we see in everyday life, used in everyday life, are plant-derived. And sometimes the purpose that the plant uses them for are very, very different than what humans have come to use these plants for. There's the Venus flytrap, which I included on here because I think it's just super cool. I love the Venus flytrap. It is one of my favorite plants, probably, just because it's so cool. Look at these leaves. And, it's made its way into popular culture in a lot of places as well. The Venus flytrap, in particular, is a good example of a couple things. One is plant intelligence. The Venus flytrap has evolved almost intelligence, with the way that it is able to sense what is prey and what is not prey, what might be just a raindrop or a dust particle or like a rock or something. And it is also even able to sense prey that is worth struggling against and digesting, and prey that is not. and it also is able to count, a rudimentary system of counting with electrical signals. You might know about these trigger hairs that 2 of them need to be triggered in order for the trap to close. So that means it can count to 2, and then it can also count to 5 because 5 trigger hairs need to be counted in order for the trap to begin digestion. And the other thing that Venus flytraps have is rapid movement. Not a lot of plants can move very rapidly. For most plants, their form of movement is just growing. If they want to move somewhere, they just grow in that direction. But Venus flytraps are one of the few plants that exhibit true movement that is very quick. And there are, it's quite disputed on how this happens, but primary hypotheses include turgor pressure and action potentials, like little electrical potentials that are sent throughout the cells at the hinge, and that influences the pressure inside of them that causes the trap to close very rapidly. And of course, we can't talk about Venus flytraps without talking about their carnivory. They eat insects, of course, as a form of nutrition because they grow in bogs that don't have a lot of nutrients in them. They evolve to get their nutrients through carnivory. There are a lot of plants that evolve this actually, but I like Venus flytraps because I think they're quite a cool example. So if there's one takeaway from the Venus flytrap, I think it would just be really cool adaptations. And let's talk about more adaptations with the cacti that have evolved to live in a very, very dry environment. And they do this without taking the easy way out, as a lot of organisms do. When I say easy way out, I mean just completely drying themselves out, waiting for rain, and then bringing themselves back to life. No, they just live. And the way they do this, they have several adaptations. One, they don't have leaves anymore, they have needles. This is very important because needles, they defend against herbivory, they have very low volume, and they also have very low surface area. So surface area to volume is kind of a general biological concept where if you have a high surface area in relation to volume, you kind of just gain and lose things very quickly. Heat, liquids, and more. And the cactus has evolved in the completely opposite direction, in where they have a very low surface area to volume ratio. I mean, they're kind of just either cylindrical, big tubes, or spheres, just really big round objects. And these have terrible surface area to volume ratios. Usually you want pits or fans or leaves to increase that. So the way they've evolved away from that habit is a great example of how they adapt to their extremely dry environment. And of course, their stems have taken up a lot of the role in the plant's main functions, and they have specific cells that hold water, their succulents. They also have a pretty cool way of releasing water from specific cells that involves turgor pressure. But I don't think I'm going to talk about that right now. More cool adaptations. We're going back to the monocots with a bunch of varied plants within the order Alismatales. So this is not all the plants in Alismatales. So a specific group of them called seagrasses. So, as I said, plants began evolution as algae living in the big ocean, and then they became embryophytes and went on the land. And not one of them went back into the ocean. Some of them went into fresh waters, but not one of them went back into the ocean until these seagrasses, which are part of order Alismatales, and these thrive in the marine environment. And most of them have their life cycle is just completely underwater. This includes pollination. Some of them are even pollinated by crabs. But aside from their extraordinary adaptations that allow them to survive underwater, they also have become just a cornerstone of underwater ecosystems. Their influence is almost as great as coral reefs. Seagrass meadows are just some of the most diverse and productive places on planet Earth. So these plants are very, very cool, and very, very important, and you probably have never even heard about them. And here are some parasitic plants. These plants in particular, Dodder, which is in genus Cuscuta, and Indian pipe, which is Monotropa uniflora, have lost the ability to photosynthesize. They don't need to make their own nutrients. You know why? Because they steal them from other plants. These are parasitic plants, which plant parasitism has evolved a few times, but I think it's most prevalent in angiosperms. They can take advantage of parasitism very well. Dodder accomplishes this using special structures called haustoria. These are basically little pegs that actually embed into the host plant's vascular tissue, and they can draw out the nutrients that way, and therefore create a big mat of, I guess, yellow kind of tendrils. They're yellow because they don't have chlorophyll. Similarly, Indian pipe also does not have chlorophyll. It is white, and therefore can, because it doesn't photosynthesize, it therefore can survive in very dark areas of forests, below the canopies where light usually does not even shine through to. And they exploit mycorrhizal interactions. This is kind of just a general phenomenon where a lot of plants form beneficial relationships with fungi that live around their roots. The fungi and plant form a mutualistic relationship by trading like metabolites to each other so that they both can survive. Now, what Indian pipe does is that it exploits this relationship by kind of hooking itself into the network of the mycorrhiza. So it takes nutrients from the fungi that the fungi has acquired from a regular plant host, but it does not give anything in return. So these are just really cool examples of life strategies that you can find in the angiosperms, and also an example of losing a synapomorphy secondarily. All plants can photosynthesize. Isn't this something everybody knows? Well, this is true, but does this mean that plants that can't photosynthesize aren't plants? No, it just means that they lost the ability to photosynthesize through evolution. Okay, so we've talked a lot about plants that are relevant to humans, whether by being yummy or by making us high. But anyways, I feel like no plants are more important or have had a bigger impact to humans than some of these cereals in the grass family, Poaceae. So these are related to your common little grasses in your lawn, but the cereals with their grains are kind of seeds and fruits because the seed coat is kind of fused with the pericarp of the fruit. But these little grains are so unbelievably important to humans. Not only do they make up the majority of our caloric intake, this is stuff like rice, wheat, barley, oats, and millet, and of course corn or maize. They make up the majority of our caloric intake. They make up basically the majority of our livestock's caloric intake, and we eat our livestock, so they're even more of our caloric intake, secondarily. But because of how we've domesticated them and used them and built entire societies around them, they are responsible for our transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculturists. They have changed the fundamental way we just live life. They have changed our genetics. We are more adapted towards eating and digesting these guys, and they have changed our culture and our history. And nations have been founded around the places that you can grow these things, and you can even distill them into beer, and beer's really good. These grains have been used for units of measurement, units of length. In fact, our shoe sizes are still kind of based on the size of like a barley grain. I don't really want to drive this point so far, but these guys are so important. It's so funny how some grasses can completely change the course of human history. So I think that that's something cool to take away. We've seen a lot of cool plants, things that do cool stuff and look pretty and taste good. And on the surface, Arabidopsis thaliana, also known as Thale cress, is none of that. This is an ugly plant, and it looks completely useless, and it seems completely useless. It seems just like a weed. It doesn't really do anything in the wild. But secretly, Arabidopsis thaliana is iconic, and that is because it is the model plant organism. Model organisms are kind of just a species that are used for studies of basic biology, just physiology and anatomy and everything about the kind of group that that organism is in. And Arabidopsis, being kind of the angiosperm model, and angiosperms are the majority of plants, is also kind of the model that scientists use to study all aspects of plant biology. Everything that we read in these textbooks have probably been influenced by research into Arabidopsis thaliana. Almost every plant biology lab knows of and has probably used and probably has Arabidopsis thaliana. Arabidopsis has several adaptations that make it key to being a perfect model organism. Its weediness kind of helps here because its life cycle is so short and it can reproduce so fastly that you can have a lot of generations of these guys, which is perfect for studies in mutations. It also is very small, so you can have a lot of them in your lab. And its genome is also very small. There's not a lot of DNA in its genome, which means it was very easy to sequence all of it, and Arabidopsis thaliana was the first plant to have its entire genome sequenced. So what looks like a very unremarkable plant might be the most iconic of them all. Thank you so much, Arabidopsis thaliana. Okay, and that kind of concludes our foray into the wide world of plants. We've talked about all sorts of plants and all sorts of cool adaptations they've made in their evolution to where they kind of are now. There's a lot of plants still alive. There's a lot of plants dead. It's pretty sad. But let's not be sad because botany is so cool. And next time we'll probably be talking about like actual plant physiology. I'll be in college, so I don't really know how that'll work, but we'll see what happens. And I'm not a perfect teacher. If you made this far, thank you so much. I'd love for you to leave some feedback for me. I'll probably should link my Discord at some point. But I'm learning. Learning is a process. Teaching is a process. Hope to become better at teaching so more people can enjoy these videos. Might make some short form content along the way as well. And before we leave off here, I want to leave you with a question, because in some of the previous videos, we've had little comprehension questions at the end that were fun, but I want to leave one that's more open-ended here. We've talked about all these plants, the diversity of plants, all these cool things that they've done so that they can survive and thrive in their environments. So I want you, the next time that you see a pretty cool plant, a pretty remarkable plant, or maybe even just an unremarkable plant that you see every single day, just kind of think about what sort of adaptations you might have made to perfectly suit and its environment. So thank you so very much, and I'll see you next time.